Okay, great. Well, I'm Michelle Newhart, and this is my husband and co-author, William Dolphin. And we're here today to talk about our book, The Medicalization of Marijuana. So welcome, everybody. We're glad to have you. And
Sure. Yeah. So, hi. As she said, am William Dolphin. Folks who know Americans for Safe Access may be subscribers to the email newsletter. So, I'm the one who's been sending you that for as long as there's been one. So, I've been working on issues around medical cannabis and patients and their experiences for the last 17 years. A lot with Americans for Safe Access, but also others. And Michelle and I both have a background that goes back that far. We met 17 years ago around cannabis issues and writing about it. So this book marks the sort of culmination of a lot of work together about trying to educate folks about how the plant works and how people's behaviors are reflected in policy and not. So.
absolutely. And so we have a nice talk prepared for you. We want to see if I can get that. Here's what the webinar is going to talk about today. We're going to start by doing a quick poll of people who are here. We'd love to hear what you think. If you can see the poll in progress there, to just go ahead and let us know what brought you here today. We're curious to learn what interested you in the webinar, and that can help us address the topics that we want to talk about today. So I can see we have some medical cannabis patients here, or friends and family of medical cannabis patients, some medical cannabis researchers as well, so that's great. And I'm glad to see that we have people who are interested in learning about the book as well.
So let's start by talking a little bit about what's in the book and what makes it different than maybe some of the other cannabis books that are out there. So again, this book is about the patient experience. So it is focused on what people report about their behaviors related to medical cannabis use. And it's a serious study of those individuals. So this was qualitative research that was conducted in Colorado, looking at people who were at midlife, so between the ages of 30 and 65, who were enrolled in the program. The folks who were interviewed extensively for it were all registered, and they represented the sort of demographic split of people enrolled in the program at the time in terms of their gender, in terms of the medical conditions they had, and the regions of the state they lived in. So Michelle can say a little bit more about how the sampling was done and the interviewing was conducted.
Sure. So on our slide here, you can see that we had a sample that was very similar to the composition of the Colorado patient population as a whole at the time that the study was done. And in the end, there were 40 in-depth interviews with patients, about a third men, 2/3 women, between 30 and 70 years old, and from all around the state of Colorado. And I keep thinking that's going to forward it, but it doesn't. In addition to that, the qualifying conditions, you don't have to have one exclusive qualifying condition, but so this doesn't necessarily add up to 100%, but 90% of those in the study did qualify under pain. It is the most umbrella qualification for lots of conditions that aren't named specifically as qualifying in most states, including Colorado. And so it's not surprising to see that, but we did also have about a third under muscle spasm, and 10% in the study, or 4 people in the study, were reported qualifying under HIV/AIDS.
I think it's reasonable to note that we have an issue around data collection with how people are using it in terms of state registries, because most states have this list of conditions, and many patients reported that their primary complaint may not have been pain, but pain was the way they could qualify for using it. So the data does not necessarily reflect that these are all just chronic pain patients, but that was an avenue toward registration.
Here's a quote from Brett. He said, frankly, I have a hard time using the word, marijuana, to be honest. We've had a few people ask why we named the book The Medicalization of Marijuana instead of choosing a different term like cannabis for our title. We did have a logic behind this. Marijuana is the name that describes the social construction of cannabis over the last 100 years. It is a word that captures the single story that we've been told about cannabis by our government and by those in authority. And that single story really we call it a single story because it treated all cannabis use as the same. There were no distinctions for how much you used or in what context you used it. It was the deviant, illicit, be very afraid name that was assigned to cannabis and carried through as a way of treating it as the social construction that it was for the last 100 years. And medicalization is a wedge in that story because it kind of forces us to consider that there are other ways that it can be used. And so that's why the medicalization of marijuana specifically.
And we make the argument that this is the most significant social construction of the century, right? I mean, it has more impact, has affected more things in terms of policy in people's lives and money than anything else as far as we can tell. The medicalization process is one of transformation, so moving from things that were not considered medical to being considered medical. And this is something that sociologists have looked at over the last several decades. It's been used to describe how conditions that were not recognized as formal medical conditions, such as fibromyalgia, come to be accepted by the institutions of medicine, so it becomes uncontroversial. And at the point where it's fully medicalized, we no longer even think of it as contested or questionable. It just is a thing. Cannabis is not yet fully there yet, but we have a list here of some of the things.
Medicalization is, simply put, it's often a process. It's actually a process of social control. Whether something falls in the medical jurisdiction or legal jurisdiction, how it's going to be treated by society. And sociology has approached this topic or used this theory for many different conditions, often things that were once deviant that were then came to be under the medical institutions. And some people see it as a negative, others can see it as a positive, often with contested illnesses that you may want a label that gives you access to medicine and to legitimate insurance coverage and all kinds of various things about that. But it can also be seen as a negative in that it is a form of social control. And
probably the best example of that is homosexuality,
sure,
which at a certain point came to be viewed as a medical problem and could be treated as a medical issue. But alcoholism, opioid addiction, depression, ADHD, these are all good examples of things which have moved into that space. So
I've included here a copy of Peter Conrad's cover. He wrote the classic sociology book called The Medicalization of Society that talks about that, and it may be something that you find interesting if you're interested in this topic. And we used his work in our work to talk about medicalization. He really laid it out where there were 5 phases of medicalization that are represented in this slide here, where it starts out by defining something as fitting within medicine, or defining something as fitting as being an issue, and Then prospection is the idea that it might fit within the medical field. When we talk about moral entrepreneurship, that's the idea that people are out there kind of campaigning for that thing to be included. Legitimacy consolidation is when we start seeing institutions working it into policies and considering how we're going to manage it as a society. And the final stage of medicalization is institutionalization. And usually at that point, we just accept it as a fact. We don't really question anymore whether it belongs in the realm of medicine or not. It becomes hard to think about it a different way. And so part of the issue with cannabis is that this medicalization process that's been well described and defined in the past with other conditions and other treatments is in process, and it fits all of these phases, but we would say that's currently incomplete. And that has a lot to do with this stage 4 legitimacy consolidation, where legitimacy is not conferred by our doctors yet or by our government. And so what ends up happening is legitimacy gets created laterally in networks through interactions by individuals. So we're always creating legitimacy in how we interact with others around this thing.
And that's different from if you've just got a prescription for some antibiotics, say. There's no need to sort of establish that your use of that medication is legitimate.
So one of the things we find that happens with this lateral legitimacy, when you don't have the, when you don't trust necessarily what is being said by your doctor or by the government about something, then people learn in different ways about this.
So what we found in talking to the patients was that they got their information through lateral networks of information, friends and family, the internet, people they met, not so much their doctors. And we can understand why. There are still, as far as I know, no medical programs in the country that provide any direct training for doctors. Now, we were just at the Marijuana for Medical Professionals conference in Denver talking about the effects of stigma and stereotype on the doctor-patient interaction. But, you know, and that provides continuing medical education credit for physicians and credit for nurses. And there were many professionals there getting educated, but that still is the exception, not the rule. So asking your doctor about whether cannabis is going to be useful for you or not may not give you a meaningful answer. And in fact, what we heard from patients was that whether or not the doctor was willing to be forthcoming had mostly to do with their own lateral networks of information, whether they personally knew someone who had benefited from it, not what the journals said, not what the science said.
So just out of curiosity, we'll go ahead and launch another poll here to just ask you, how do you first get information about medical cannabis? And feel free to choose your answer in the poll there. And while we're allowing people to answer that, I see there's a comment from Nat Dean that asks, does Colorado allow PTSD as a qualifying condition? Yes, they did pass PTSD. It went through multiple attempts. There was something built into the law to allow them to petition for additional conditions. Sorry, grab that.
Yeah, but it was recently signed into law, but again, it was a struggle and it was rejected over and over again. And one of the unfortunate things we see around these qualifying condition lists is that even when there are multiple petitions and there's compelling evidence, and when the committee or board that is supposed to be advising officials says, yes, this is a treatable condition, people in charge can still say no. And that happened around this in Colorado, but fortunately they have moved forward.
Yeah, there was a clear pattern to rejection of multiple conditions that were petitioned in Colorado because there was a reluctance to pass conditions that were considered mental health conditions as opposed to pain or physical conditions. That was kind of an interesting pattern in how that worked out. But PTSD did ultimately pass, and now multiple states have passed PTSD. I see in our polling, we had about 33%, or 3 out of 9 people who answered our poll said they learned about medical cannabis first from their doctor. Here, let me share the results with you. About half of you said you either learned from a friend or family member, or from the internet, or from other research. And what we found in the study with interviews with patients is that there was a lot of information that passed along friend and family networks. So do you want to talk about that for a minute?
Well, there's no discounting the importance of the networks of family, right? And the people in this study, for the most part, had cannabis as a medicine of last resort. So they had tried many other things, and they were pretty much at the end of their rope. And people around them saw that and intervened. And many of them described some friend or family member being very assertive about saying, this is really something you should try. I'm pretty sure this is going to work for you, even as far as bringing something over and saying, okay, now's the time, let's do this.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, I mean, one of the, so I put up a quote here that had to do with that sense of who you're surrounded by and what their opinions are of cannabis. And this is a lot of what happens, is that the general environment of uncertainty, or learning through indirect information how the people around you feel about it. And this carried over not just in workplaces or with family members, but also in doctor-patient interactions. That sense of uncertainty,
a lot of reticence.
Reticence due to concerns that you would be stereotyped by your doctor. Absolutely.
Yeah. And, when we were talking to the folks in Colorado recently, one of the things we brought out, not from our book, but from recent research done there, indicated that in the survey of patients and doctors that Conrad recently conducted, fully half of them had not discussed it at all with their doctors. So they were using medical cannabis. It wasn't they went and asked for a recommendation and got turned down. They went to the specialty market, they got a recommendation, they enrolled in the program, and they did not disclose it at all. And, again, there are reasons for that. Doctors can be judgmental, and nobody likes to be on the wrong end of, the stereotypes and the stigma, whether that's with your coworkers or family members or your doctor.
Absolutely. So one of the things we talked about was that the medicalization of marijuana, we spend a good chunk of the core of the book talking about when you change the context in which you use marijuana from a social use to a medical one. You change the drug itself, you change the mindset going into using it, and you change the setting in which it is used. And this goes back to Timothy Leary, and also it was the life work of Norman Zinberg, who wrote a book called Drug Set and Setting, that says, the effect of a drug is not just a one-to-one ratio of taking the drug and it has the same effect. And the placebo effect lets us know this too. I mean, we know that placebo effect is exactly the effect of set and setting on something. It's anticipation of an effect and the expectations tied to that. And so with marijuana, we also see by changing drug set and setting from a social use to a medical one, we can see how all three of these are transformed in those different contexts.
That's right. And the patients described making very conscious decisions about how they used it, their intent with using it, and specifically the setting. Many of them described that they could differentiate between social use and medical use by whether or not they were with other people, which sort of goes without saying in terms of the word social. But nonetheless, they created routines around their use that look very much like what we understand about how people use other medications. A min-max strategy is typically employed, in which ahead of us on the slides here.
Yeah, it's okay.
Sorry,
Sure
I'm jumping around a little bit.
Yeah,
There we go. The min-max strategy. So trying to minimize the amount of medication used and maximizing the functionality, minimizing the symptoms and the side effects, right? So we understand this from how people report using pharmaceutical medications. You know, some people take it exactly as directed. Many people start cutting pills in half or adjusting dose on the fly to try to get the maximum amount of benefit out of it and the minimum amount of side effects.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And so the quotes we had on the last slide here give some examples from the book about the ways that we saw people trying to parse out this difference between their own recreational versus medical use. And feel free to make comments in the chat if you like about your own experience with parsing out medical and recreational use. I really like the quote from Beth, who was a Jehovah's Witness and had chronic pain. As a witness, her prerogative was she couldn't really use anything that was considered harmful to your body. So for instance, she would not smoke cannabis because she felt like that was introducing an insult to the body that was not within her religious beliefs. But I loved her answer to this question about medical and recreational, where she said, I'm kind of back and forth with that. While I'd like to be able to tell you that I only medicate when I hurt, I can also tell you that at my age, you pretty much hurt most of the time. So I could always in reality tell you, yes, I can take it for pain and that's the only reason. But I'll choose to relieve my pain like 15 minutes before Frasier comes on, because what do they say about laughter? It's the best medicine. So
the best word I've heard for describing the distinction is that it's porous, right? And that, you know, it can be simultaneously enjoyable as with watching Frasier, but also directed at symptom relief. And people will shift back and forth, and the patients in this study, as we say, code switched back and forth between medical terminology and non-medical terminology in describing their own use.
And it's a thin slice sometimes between managing pain and experiencing pleasure. And so there were people all across the board on this, from saying that all use is medical, regardless of whether you realize your use is medical or not, kind of in line with Dennis Peron's maxim about that. And there were people who wanted to make a finer grade distinctions between what medical use and recreational use look like.
And there were even people who were using it clearly therapeutically. They had diagnosed conditions, but they did not consider their conditions to be terribly serious. So they still felt like their choice to use cannabis was an optional one. And they distinguished that from folks who were more seriously injured or ill, about which there could be little concern. And for folks who were extremely ill or injured, there was a general sense that, well, anytime, anywhere they're using it, doesn't matter what it looks like or who they're with, that's clearly medical. And we see that reflected somewhat in how people talk about it in society generally too, that at a certain point, you know, we have an acceptance of people's ability to make decisions about it, and we'll just take their word for it.
Well, one of the arguments that we make in the book is that, I mean, because this is a flexible drug at this point that has these uses, and neither use is going away anytime soon. And so I think there was a point in time where it seemed like the media was obsessed with this question of splitting medical and recreational apart. And again, this idea that legitimacy comes from gets pushed back on the individual to make those calls. And so, you know, and the suggestion that recreational kind of meant not just for fun, but also that was the illegal version of using it. It was intoxication. It was somehow, the morally negative use of it. Whereas if you were using it medically, you were using it in some good fashion, and you were supposed to parse out whether you were being good or bad morally somehow on this issue. But I think ultimately, one argument that we suggest here is that maybe this isn't an individual distinction. Maybe it's more important at an institutional level where you're creating structures around this. And there we feel like there absolutely should be space for medical that is maintained, and that it's more important to parse that out institutionally maybe than at the individual level where it blurs.
That's right. I mean, and we've seen that in developing policies in the individual states about whether this gets treated as medical, or whether if we're going to institute adult use, as has recently happened in California and of course a host of other states, what does that mean about the existing medical program in those states? Do you jettison it completely? I mean, we've just seen our neighbor to the north, Canada, institute adult use across the nation. And at the point where they did that, the Canadian Medical Association, or at least their spokesman, suggested, well, we can now get rid of the medical program because we don't need it anymore. And based on what we've heard from patients and over many years, as well as in this study, that's not true. The needs of patients are different, and they're multiple. Part of it is the legitimacy of what they're up to. And while almost all but Beth in this study said that if it were made illegal tomorrow, they are now fully convinced and they're not about to cease their use. However, it's still, these legal risks and other professional risks are significant barriers to folks. And there's a reason that it was a medicine of last resort for these folks.
So we already talked about min-max strategy, but we can talk a little bit more about risks and how patients combat stigma. I thought this quote, I included this quote because I thought it was a pretty interesting quote from Tina, who she had been through a lot. She had multiple diagnoses, and she had been through a slew of pharmaceuticals to try to deal with those that had led to sort of a bad cycle that was a pharmaceutical treadmill of just adding more prescriptions onto prescriptions until she had a pretty toxic combination going on, and at some point decided to get off of all of the prescriptions and slowly abated with those and used medical cannabis. But when I asked patients about how they identified with cannabis as an issue, there was a real split. Some had to say that they took great pride in it and were kind of out and proud about cannabis use, but other people just really wanted it to be normal. They didn't want to have to be out and proud about it. They just wanted it to mix in with all the other things that you could do in life and not be a notable quality. And so that comes back to identity. And Tina said, it's not my identity. I have more identities. I would say it's my medicine. When I was taking other medicines, I didn't run around making that a part of my identity. And so I just thought she was an interesting counterexample, because we certainly had plenty of people who were very enthusiastic about cannabis, but then we had, Tina and others like her who just felt like this was a private decision, and they just didn't want to feel subject to stigma around it. They didn't necessarily want to wrap their identity around it.
And I think we can see this is similar to the medical conditions themselves. There are people who are willing to disclose what their medical condition is. They want to advocate publicly for more funds for research or more support for themselves and others that are similarly situated. And there are other folks who are like, you know what, I am not a cancer patient. I'm someone who's living with cancer, and that's part of what I'm doing, but that's not who I am. Now, the cannabis use stuff becomes slightly different because, again, of the stereotype and the stigma. And how you push back against that, can vary quite a bit, but nonetheless, part of it is about establishing that what has been said about it, that it's an intoxicant, that's the only reason it's ever used, that it's criminal, that it's deviant, is not true of you in your medical use. And the folks, come to occupy a similar kind of place in terms of their views about this. So whether they were, sort of left-oriented politics, right-oriented politics, everybody settles into a somewhat libertarian position where autonomy over your own body and the decisions you make about what you put in it is your prerogative, and the government should not be directly interfering in that. Nonetheless, again, on the institutional side, many folks would like to see access through their regular medical institutions, that if they're in the hospital, they can use it. They could go to a pharmacy and fill a prescription, and most importantly, get their health insurance to pay for it.
I'm glad you mentioned that, because one of the things that we did talk about was this idea of cannabis in the context of medicine, health, and big pharma. One of the final chapters in the book talks about the difference between medicalization, grouping something into the medical institution and culturally in with medicine, versus pharmaceuticalization, because not all medicine, even though more and more medicine consists of taking pharmaceutical drugs, that is not the only form of treatment that's available through medical institutions and medicine generally. And so Leo, who was quite colorful in his language, he had an extended quote of which I've grabbed part of, where he said, you want to know what really makes me angry? I'll sit here and watch commercials about a drug made by Pfizer or whoever, and they'll sit there and go, well, it'll help your calluses on your feet, but it might do this and that and that and that and kill you. So I'm going, all the shit that happens on the side is worse than the thing it cures. So, there were many people in the study who had long-term illnesses for which they'd been prescribed or overprescribed pharmaceuticals. And they had reasons to feel wary about pharmaceuticalizing cannabis as opposed to medicalizing it. And I think those two things are separable, and we can think about them and a
lot of concern for how profit motives factor into it. Most of them had come to a conclusion that pharmaceutical companies were driven by profit motive, not by caring about patients. And there was an articulated concern that cannabis not go down that road. So, people want more targeted medications, more standardized medications, something that's more predictable. Folks know that even if you're going to a dispensary and you're getting the same strain name, over time that's going to change. And particularly if you go to multiple places. And at the conference we were just at, there was a lot of talk about really kind of getting into the details of the plant composition and figuring out how to find more targeted ways at treating specific symptoms and illnesses.
And Gayla Berry had asked on our chat, when do we anticipate medicinal cannabis will move into the institutional phase? And so if I go back to the phases here, one of the things that, they're presented in a linear fashion as if they go from A to B to C, but they don't. These phases overlap, and in fact, there's no guarantee that things move forward. Things can move in and out of medicalization, as homosexuality has. So for better or for worse, things can move in and out of this space. But having said that, I think we're already seeing the beginning of an overlap with legitimacy, consolidation, and institutionalization. And the reason I say that is because of the number of prestigious universities who have taken up this issue and put significant clinical funds toward research that are at many major universities. UC Irvine just got a $10 million grant to do research. We know Harvard and UCLA have programs, and these are all within the last couple of years that we've seen a lot of big U.S. universities come on board with studying this. And so that to me is a signal that things are moving toward institutionalization.
Now, it's also important to note that because this is not a single compound medication in the way most pharmaceuticals are, it poses extra challenges for physicians. This is not unique. There were plenty of botanical medicines used at the turn of the century, but the preference within medicine went to what they considered to be more predictable outcomes. Of course, anybody who has dealt with mental health prescribing, if you go in for depression, it's a sort of series of medications they'll try and changing dosages. So there's, plenty of examples within pharmaceutical medications where there needs to be a lot of back and forth between patients and doctors to establish what's actually working. But part of what we talk about in this is that there are two separate logics at work.
Yes.
Within medicine, there's a system logic. And for people, the patients, there's more of what we would call a life world logic.
So the system and the life world are classical sociology concepts that we've applied here. It's been applied to medicines by others like Nikki Britton, who's a famous British medical researcher. And so we've applied those concepts to this. And so system just means when you're, they can apply to the very same people, but in different roles. So when you're in a system role, you're functioning in an organization, like when you're at work, and your goals are toward things like efficiency or efficacy. You might think about what success looks like differently in terms of how you're going to monitor and standardize that and work through processes. Life world is you with your family at home and caring holistically about how things are going to affect all of your relationships, how they're going to work with your overall functioning in your life and your quality of life, which system may not care about that very much. So thinking about the system logic and the life world logic, one of the things we propose is that, one of the reasons why marijuana has been outside of the medical system is it's not actually a very good substance. It hasn't been very amenable to a lot of the processes by which we standardize and isolate other drugs, but it's an awesome life world medicine. It's subjective, it's flexible, and it allows for a lot of... and
it's remarkably safe.
Yes,
and that's,
yes.
Let's not lose sight of that. That part
Absolutely.
of why people can experiment with it and figure out what's going to work and not work is they're not in danger of toxic overdose in the way they are with any other medication. So the supervision necessary by a medical professional is less, and the subjective experience of it, what we might call a side effect, is often used by patients as a way of monitoring how much dosage they have on board. Yeah. So there's a feedback loop. So even though the plant products are highly variable, we have a good way of judging their efficacy and doing so quickly.
Yeah, so we hope you will check out our book if you get a chance. We got a copy of it here. There is a 20% off code through Americans for Safe Access for joining our webinar today. And I'd like to open it up to any questions or comments that you'd like to make. And we sure appreciate you coming out to listen today. So.
Go ahead and type anything into the chat
about
comment
the book
you'd like to hear about.
I saw Nat Dean added that San Diego State was among them doing autism spectrum research, which is some great new research in the cannabis field.
Yeah, there's some really remarkable stories out there. Folks who read the newsletter saw the profile of the Zartler family in Texas, whose daughter has a self-injuring autism that is controlled by cannabis use, and there's some really powerful opportunities with that. One of the things that was very remarkable that we heard at the conference in Denver was one of the researchers quoting someone else who said in a review article that all disease states in humans may be implicated in the endocannabinoid system. So that cannabinoids provide a potential means of treating basically almost anything that's wrong with you. And we had the privilege of hearing from Dr. Misholam, the chemist who first found THC and identified its chemical composition, and whose lab is still producing amazing research. And he took us through a few of the really exciting things around, for instance, type 1 diabetes, unbelievable study showing the efficacy of CBD, and a remarkable study clinical study done with schizophrenics that found that high dosage CBD in the 700 to 800 milligram per day range was as effective as the most powerful antipsychotic in controlling schizophrenia, but with zero side effects versus a drug that has fairly horrific side effects.
Yeah, so Gayla Berry asked how universities that we mentioned are accessing cannabis, and that's a great question. Maybe you want to speak to that.
Yeah, this is a mess, and it has been for some time. So folks who've been following this know that there's one source, and it's the farm at the University of Mississippi that's run by NIDA, the National Institute on Drug Abuse, which by its very name tells you that, you know, providing medical research materials is not part of their mission. So that has been a barrier, as well as the quality of the cannabis produced there has been questionable.
And it isn't that other places have not volunteered to become sources.
Right.
In fact, Lyle Craker tried for years, if not decades, to become an additional source to no avail.
And the DEA administrative law judge who heard that case said, yes, absolutely, it's in the public interest. We need to make more licenses available. Interesting thing is the DEA has conceded on that. They said, yeah, we're ready. They opened applications. They have many of them, and the Department of Justice is currently blocking those. So we need more pressure on them. There's legislation in Congress to try to make that more available. There are folks who are ready to go. The DEA has said they'll sign off on it, but Department of Justice has a hand in it, unfortunately.
And Nat Dean just mentioned that San Diego, being in California, they're working with people who are already patients and they aren't administering, but they're working to keep track of the percent being administered. There's a similar program, a very innovative program they've tried at University of Colorado at Boulder, where they actually have a mobile van that goes around and talks to people who have already ingested cannabis from dispensaries or other locations. But as we learn in these are great ideas for how to study in this environment. But as we learned at the medical conference, not knowing what somebody took or the composition of the thing that was taken is a serious detriment to clinical work.
There needs to be some type of standardization to be able to make any kind of meaningful claims about the outcomes. So while there are plenty of folks who can go and get something where they say, yep, this is what I got and I feel like this is working for me, and you could perhaps even measure the clinical effects of it, figuring out exactly what it was they had in the first place is a challenge. The Israelis have been doing a fantastic job on this front, because they have a program in which they do very detailed chemical analysis of the medical products that are being provided to their patients. They follow the patients very closely. And we heard a talk recently from one of those researchers describing two patients that had very challenging medical conditions. They'd lost the supplier, but they thought, well, we're fine, because we know the chemical composition of what we were giving them. We'll match it to something else that we have. They found something that they thought matched, gave it to them, was not effective. So this is part of what, the cutting edge of research is dealing with, is this recognition that it's not as simple as, well, what was the THC content? What was the CBD content? There's a lot of other chemicals that are clearly influencing the effectiveness, the entourage effect of the whole plant medicine. So having a more nuanced understanding of how terpenes and other chemicals present in the plant are operating on people is important. So,
and I mean, as it's already clear, we're not clinical scientists. I'm not an MD, I'm a PhD. We do social science. And I think that, one of the takeaways from this study, though, is that clinical science is obviously extremely important, but behavioral science also has something to contribute to this conversation, because behavior around cannabis is important in terms of its consequences and effects, and how people understand it, how it's framed, has everything to do with reducing stigma and bringing us into a new era here.
Well, and establishing policies, right?
Yes.
Because policymakers are often operating in a void of information. They don't really understand what the needs of patients are, how that can be differentiated from non-patients, and they still have to make laws and regulations about what to do. So, understanding what it is people are actually doing is important. And of course, we've all, heard over the many years how little clinical research there is around many conditions, almost all. The only thing that we have anything like a body of evidence around is pain management, but even that's limited. There's a total of 40 clinical studies.
Yeah.
So, compared to other medications and conditions, that's extremely limited. There is almost no behavioral science on this. Sad to say, this book is one of the first to look at how people actually use it medically. We hope
when they're in a state program, and specifically, there are some other studies of use, but they aren't. This is the first comprehensive study of older adults using it within a state program, and so we hope that's going to help states that are following Colorado in that model and looking at the push and pull factors that affected behavior of these patients around it and what their concerns were, which ranged from, how the cost of medicine to how policies might affect their risks, and also how the narratives that surround that and the misinformation that also can surround these issues, and how we can make policy that better protects patients and better informs them.
So a couple of other questions. Nat has asked about New Mexico's legislative hearing that will examine children using medical cannabis at school, and asking if we had looked into factors involved with use in patients who are minors. And the answer is not in this study. We were concerned with patients at midlife because there are different expectations around what cannabis use means at different stages of life. And again, back to our drug set and setting. Setting includes where you are in your life. If you're a teenager or a young college student, cannabis use is not that unusual for the environment. But when you are...
And in fact, most of the people in the study, but not all, had a history of use that was teen use, followed by many years of no use, followed by deciding to experiment with medical use at midlife or, to late midlife. And so there were some people who had used it throughout their adult lives. There were there was a handful of people who also had never used it prior to trying it medicinally. So we had several different profiles represented, but by far the most common one was teen experimentation, a big gap of taking on adult responsibilities and feeling like that didn't fit with that, leading up to medicinal use in the modern medical cannabis environment.
And, of course, the stereotyping and the stigma changes over time as well. So it's different for somebody who is at midlife and a professional and has a family to initiate cannabis use at that point than somebody who's just like, going to parties when they're in college. So another question asked about the World Health Organization, if they're currently looking at it. I'm very glad to say they are. They just had a recommendation on CBD, which said that CBD does not need to be scheduled at all. It is safe to use. It has no abuse potential. It does not need to be regulated. They are now, and I'm happy to say as well that Americans for Safe Access played a part in providing them with the scientific information that formed the basis for that decision. The other thing that's happening immediately now is what's called a critical review of THC and cannabis as a whole plant and some of the other constituents and extracts made from it. This is the first critical review of cannabis ever conducted by the World Health Organization. Now, what's important about the WHO is that they advise the UN. So UN is responsible for some of the international agreements around this. One of the things that folks hide behind around the prohibition around cannabis is that, well, we signed a treaty that says we're going to keep it illegal. And true, the single convention on narcotics is there. But it can be modified. And the recommendations of the World Health Organization go to that. I'm also happy to note that the current Secretary General of the UN was the Prime Minister of Portugal when Portugal radically changed its drug laws to make basically everything legal, and with great positive consequences. Drug abuse dropped, crimes associated with it dropped, and he's enthusiastic about the idea of coming to more science-based policies around this.
And thanks to Nat Dean for providing that link to a questionnaire that's a questionnaire about seeking information for recommendations about how the WHO will look at medical cannabis.
Right.
So feel free to take advantage of
So that's
that
going
link.
through our Food and Drug Administration because, of course, you know, the U.S. is a signatory and a part of the World Health Organization. So people are providing information to them from lots of different avenues.
And, you know, just to stick with the book, our book is an educational tool. It's meant to help people who don't understand this issue get a better sense and grasp of what's going on if they don't have any direct, you know, exposure, or it can help them understand what's going on with medical cannabis better. And including a chapter, the second chapter of the book, which talks about policy and how these policies are interwoven from international level all the way down to the local level, and how that constrains changing policy, how that's affected why policies change slowly in some respects, and why everybody was kind of holding their breath when we had state policies pass to see kind of how these different layers of law were going to kick in, and you know, how they were going to be interpreted.
And you know, in the U.S. story, the difficulty of getting legislation through. So I mean, it can seem like the federal government is monolithic in opposition to this, but that's not true. You know, from the very first, as soon as the Controlled Substances Act passed, there was legislation seeking to change the status of marijuana under the law. Marijuana is, of course, the term that's used in the law. And every year since then, there's been multiple bills presented to either allow medical use, to make it decriminalized, to enable research. I mean, just a host of different things, just to allow folks who end up in federal court when they're compliant with a state program to be able to tell a jury that they were compliant with a state program. You know, fortunately right now we do have operational an amendment to the budget for the Department of Justice that prevents them from spending funds interfering with state medical cannabis programs. And federal courts have ruled that that means you can't go after patients if they are compliant with state law. But again, that's something that only applies to the budget for the particular year. They have to renew it every year. It's not, you know, legislation that's long-term. So we're really hoping that we're going to see a change. Pete Sessions has been the chairman of the Rules Committee in the House and has effectively blocked every bit of legislation that's been put forward. So I understand he's in a tough fight for re-election, and you know, House leadership may change, and you know, attitudes may change. This has been a bipartisan issue from the beginning as well. This is not Democrat or Republican. This is about compassion and rational policy, and there are folks on both sides of the aisle who see it that way and are trying to make a difference.
Well, we thank you for joining us to hear about our book and our research and some of its outcomes. This is just a sampling of what's included in the book, but the book also does a great job, I might say, of summarizing over 400 different citations in this book that summarizes articles that are in academic journals and maybe behind firewalls that you don't have access to read. It helps synthesize that information and provide it. So it's got a strong evidence basis, both in interviews that were in depth and structured through an IRB at a university, and also through the extensive literature that it summarizes.
Yeah, we may have been a little bit, shall we say, overachieving on the citations on it. The bibliography is quite long, but again, around this topic in particular, establishing credibility, establishing legitimacy is a big challenge. So we tried to make it as comprehensive and authoritative as possible, so it could be a resource for advocates, for patients, for policymakers, for academics to further study this issue, because it's incredibly important that we do this better. Too many people have suffered at the hands of misguided policies and misinformation. So getting a little more rational about what people actually do and what the cannabis plan actually is going to help everyone. So we hope this has made a contribution to it. We have just a couple of minutes left if there's any other questions.
And thank you, Gayla, for joining us, and thank you, David, for your comments. I hope you're right about Jeff Sessions. And Nat, you asked for a table of contents. I'd be happy to get your email address and send you a table of contents to recommend to your library.
I can say, an easy way for people to see more about the book is to go on Amazon, because they have a preview of the book that includes the early chapters. It has the full table of contents. If you go to our publisher's site at Routledge, so when you signed up for the webinar, you should have gotten a link to the publisher site along with that discount code, and they have the table of contents there as well, so that can be helpful. And Amazon has not the discount, but they do have the previews of the first many pages, so you can get a sense of how the book works. So we've sort of sold that this is very serious and academic. I can say that what most people report is that it's more readable than they expect, because it is so driven by patient stories. The interviews run throughout the book, and you get a sense of who the folks are as their stories carry across from one chapter to a next. It's organized in the order in which patients confront the issues around medical cannabis, but filled with really engaging and interesting stories, and some really startling stuff too.
Absolutely. Well,
I think that's probably
we reached
it.
the end of our hour.
Thank you all very much.
Pull us back to here, and thanks for participating. And
see you next time.
See you next time.